So let's get started. Today, I'm so excited to moderate our discussion about the greatly anticipated hydrogen production tax credit, better known as 45V, which was passed in the Inflation Reduction Act. So hi, everyone. I'm Taylor Kraus, and I currently manage our federal policy team's industrial decarbonization portfolio at RMI. Prior to RMI, I worked in government affairs at Boundary Stone Partners while completing my master's thesis on hydrogen at Johns Hopkins Energy Policy Program. As many of you know, recently on Friday, December 22nd, the US Treasury Department released their proposed guidance for the credit, which is an incentive that many know allows for up to $3 per kilogram of hydrogen produced using clean power sources, better known as 45E. So this credit has garnered a lot of attention as it is not only monetarily rich, but has far-reaching potential to affect clean energy markets beyond just hydrogen producers. So today we have three speakers who will cover an overview of the guidance itself, as well as expand on the overarching impacts the guidance may have on one, emissions, two, hydrogen projects, and three, the market itself. During the webinar, please feel free to drop any questions that you have in the Q&A function on your screen, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can during the Q&A. But again, we'll do our best to try and make sure that we cover those after this webinar if we run out of time. Also, we hope today provides future opportunities for collaboration and iterative thinking. As many in this call are also aware, next on the horizon of the hydrogen policy landscape is the public comment period, which is the policy process that will bring this initial guidance to final rule. And it's kind of due relatively soon on February 26th. So our team hopes to gather the insights from this webinar, as well as collaborate afterwards with the attendees on comment submissions. So we hope this is not just a presentation, but the start of a dialogue, and you reach out after the webinar. So I'm going to introduce our speakers, Alex Piper, Maria Martinez, and Tessa Weiss, but would like to first thank all the other RMI members that are not speakers, but are still helping with the webinar, and more importantly, have supported with the culmination of our hydrogen policy development over the past year and a half. So thank you, Nathan Iyer, Natalie Jinzhou, and Jane Sadler. So I'll begin with introductions of the speakers in order and start with Alex. Alex is a senior associate on RMI's federal policy team, where he focuses on industrial decarbonization and hydrogen policy. At RMI, he has been a jack of all industrial decarbonization trade, and I'd say a master of hydrogen. He has mainly worked on sustainable aviation fuel, fertilizer decarbonization, and has probably worked with you and your team on 45V implementation efforts. Prior to coming to RMI in 2022, Alex was on the Hill. He worked for then Congressman Peter Welch and Senator Patrick Leahy on their energy and environment portfolios. Next is Tessa. Tessa is a senior associate on RMI's Climate Aligned Industries team, where she focuses on clean hydrogen as well as ammonia market and infrastructure development, where she really has been an analytical powerhouse for our team. And prior to RMI, she worked for the startup Oklo, designing small modular nuclear reactors. And last but not least is Maria. Maria is part of the Breakthrough Energy team and is based in Washington, D.C. I've worked with Maria on hydrogen before, even being at RMI, and can confidently say she's an expert in this space. So we're lucky to have her as a speaker today. Maria currently leads planning, evaluation, and strategy development as part of Breakthrough Energy's U.S. policy and advocacy team, where she manages Breakthrough's clean fuels policy portfolio, as well as develops engagement and advocacy strategies on a suite of technology areas to advance the drive toward a net zero economy that we are all interested in. So with that all-star lineup introduced, I'll pass it off to Alex to get us started. Alex?
Thank you, Taylor. Let's start with some basics and background and make sure we're all on the same page. The Inflation Reduction Act, signed into law in 2022, established 45V clean hydrogen production tax credit. The top value of $3 per kilogram of low carbon hydrogen is one of the most valuable existing clean energy incentives. The value of the credit is emissions-based, technology neutral, and requires prevailing wage and apprenticeship to unlock the full value. Statute also clarifies that the well-to-gate life cycle greenhouse gas emissions rate, as defined by the Clean Air Act, will determine the credit value. Guidance for this credit is necessarily complex because a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions calculation across a variety of hydrogen production pathways must address direct and indirect emissions impacts for qualifying projects. This webinar will explore what that proposed rule looks like for electrolytic systems and the implications. Next slide. First, a few important points on the proposed rule. 1, the guidance aligns with statute and provides clarity and certainty for industry. This guidance expands eligibility for grid-connected projects and establishes guardrails to reduce emissions impacts. Second, as defined by statute, grid-connected systems must use the average grid emissions under the GREET model. To differentiate from the grid average and thus qualify for the credit, another tool must be used, and that is why Treasury is proposing the use of energy attribute certificates, or EACs, as a proxy for direct electricity procurement. The flexibility of trading and retiring EACs opens the door to a variety of contract types. Third, the 3 attributes an EAC must demonstrate are incrementality, deliverability, and hourly accounting. We'll discuss these further throughout the webinar. Fourth, Treasury allows projects to propose new hydrogen production pathways and request a pathway-specific emissions rate to qualify for the credit if their particular pathway is not included in the current GREET model. And finally, this webinar focuses largely on electrolytic hydrogen. However, it's important to note that gas-based pathways will play a large role in hydrogen production and will attempt to qualify for the 45V tax credit. Treasury has explicitly asked for recommendations and thoughts on how to do life cycle emissions analyses on pathways that utilize biomethane and fugitive methane. Next slide. Incrementality, or new clean power, as some have referred to it, is the vintage requirement for the clean electricity powering clean hydrogen production. Treasury is proposing that the clean electricity being claimed be placed in service no more than 36 months before the hydrogen production begins. The 36-month window itself is a flexibility for projects, and it supports early movers by creating an ever-growing pie of clean electricity attributes. Other flexibilities include an 80-20 rule for facility renovations, curtailment, and production on the cleanest grids with emissions caps. Treasury is requesting comment on their proposal to allow 5% of existing clean power to qualify as incremental. This is proposed to support generators that may face retirement, support existing clean renewables that face curtailment, and otherwise increase the pool of available attributes in the early days of the credit. Next slide. The incrementality rule is important for a few reasons. First, incrementality helps avoid direct emissions increase as new hydrogen load competes with existing clean electricity for other decarbonization end uses, such as power sector and transportation. It also allows grid-connected projects to access a lower emissions threshold than what is calculated using the GREET model and the grid average emissions. Second, this requirement also creates a strong incentive to build new clean electricity. Importantly, it incentivizes the build-out of a diverse array of generators to support higher capacity factors in hydrogen production. It further incentivizes research, development, and deployment of innovative clean firm electricity, such as geothermal. And in areas where energy development is not keeping pace with hydrogen development, this rule creates an incentive to build more clean electricity. The rule also provides flexibility with a rolling 36-month vintage. And that means first movers, again, can procure clean electricity already in the pipeline and will have growing access to qualified clean electricity as time goes on. On temporal matching, until January 1st, 2028, projects will be able to match the electricity used for qualifying clean hydrogen production with clean electricity on an annual basis. After that date, every project will need to match their clean electricity with hydrogen production on an hourly basis. This transition period gives time for projects to operationalize hourly matching strategies and gives time for hourly matching registries to fully mature and become available nationwide. There are a few outstanding questions on temporal matching, and these include what will happen with projects that miss an hour. In other words, how will Treasury address projects that do not temporally match for an hour at a time and therefore generate more emissions during that hour than would qualify them for the tax credit? Another question is how electricity storage will play into hourly matching requirements. And finally, does the 5-year transition give enough time for data infrastructure to be set up? And will projects have the near and long-term certainty to secure financing? RMI has produced analysis that demonstrates why phasing in this hourly match requirement is important and why the timing makes sense. This analysis demonstrates that significant emissions increases result if annual matching is used throughout the lifetime of the credit. Therefore, hourly matching is critical to meeting statutory requirements of low emissions hydrogen production. RMI also finds that stunting green hydrogen growth in the early years, which may by default allow gas-based hydrogen to take on a larger market share, can result in higher emissions than if the enabling infrastructure for green hydrogen liftoff in early years is established and strength in the market is secured. It follows then that a delayed start for hourly matching can help provide the flexibility needed for the green hydrogen industry to take root and begin to scale in the early years. And by phasing in an hourly matching requirement in 2028, there is greater expectation that the green hydrogen industry will have achieved liftoff and will be governed by climate-aligned rules throughout the credit lifetime. And the final requirement for a compliant EEC, next slide please, is deliverability. The proposed rule states that clean electricity production must be located in the same Department of Energy grid congestion zone as the hydrogen production facility. You can see the map here on the right outlines the grid congestion zones as proposed. Outstanding opportunities for comment include whether there should be ways to demonstrate deliverability if the two facilities are located in different grid regions, and whether those regions should be adjusted in any way. Next slide, please. So that's a basic outline of what's in the proposed rule as it stands right now, opportunities for comment and outstanding questions. And the rest of the webinar, I will turn it over to Maria and Tessa to explore potential emissions, industry, and market implications of these rules.
Thanks so much, Alex. Hopefully you all can see me. My name is Maria Martinez. As mentioned, I'm a director of U.S. policy and advocacy at Breakthrough Energy. For those of you not familiar with Breakthrough Energy, we're a network of philanthropic investment and policy initiatives founded by Bill Gates in 2015, all working together to scale the technologies we need to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Thank you to the RMI team for the invitation to share some perspective on this conversation today. First, I'll say Breakthrough Energy views clean hydrogen as a very important climate solution. 45V is potentially the most consequential policy in that regard. It's going to help really accelerate the development and deployment of this important technology. So it's one we're watching closely. And over the past year, it certainly has drawn enormous interest and engagement from a very broad array of stakeholders, which is pretty unusual, especially for a tax credit, but it's great to see all of the interest. I'll spend a few minutes sharing some of our perspectives on the tax credit as proposed by the Treasury and IRS in the December notice of proposed rulemaking, how that might drive emissions outcomes and impact the way that the hydrogen industry might evolve in the coming years. But first and foremost, I'll say it's incredibly important to acknowledge that the guidance is finally out after a long year, probably 13 or 14 months after Treasury initially took comment on these rules, and that is hugely important. Policy can be a very important catalyst to deploying technologies, but it could also be a hampering force if there's a lot of regulatory uncertainty. So we're really excited to just see some of this guidance out and start providing that clarity that's needed to take action and for projects to know what resources will be required to start building projects, which is crucial when you're talking about multi-billion-dollar investments. So as Alex was alluding to, 45V is a especially complex technical puzzle because of the unique relationship between the impacts of certain hydrogen production pathways on the broader energy system. And so honestly, this year has taught me a lot of humility about just how complex that relationship is. And kudos to everyone in the government doing God's work to try to make reason out of all of that input that they've been receiving. So Breakthrough really likes to put science first. We're very science driven. And once the rules came out in December, the proposed rules, the first order of business for us was to try to wrap our heads around what the potential impact of this rule might be on a number of dimensions. So if we can move to the next slide, let's first take a look at emissions. So we wanted to get a sense of what the cumulative system emissions impact of electrolyzer deployment will be under these rules. I'm picking electrolyzers in particular because they have a much more outsized impact on other parts of the system. But in a moment, I'll touch on other important production pathways and their implications as well. So these projections will really vary in the long term, depending on how fast technology takes off. So we worked with the fine folks at the Rhodium Group who are doing really great work to model these types of questions and have been doing it for many years. They've been working with MIT University to maintain a clean investment monitor tool, which they're tracking a wide array of different clean energy projects on. And for electrolyzers, as of late last year, they had cataloged 4.7 gigawatts of announced electrolyzer projects. So they use this as their sample size pipeline of projects to do analysis around. On the left side, what you'll see is 3 deployment scenarios they took a look at. Slow deployment, which is pretty much half of the pipeline of projects that's been announced getting built out by 2027. A mid-growth scenario is that entire pipeline actually getting built out by 2027. And then a fast growth scenario where all announced projects come online 2 years ahead of schedule. I want to be very clear that the fast growth scenario is very, very unlikely at this point. Supply chain challenges, interest rates, macroeconomic conditions, and other factors will make that pretty unlikely at this point. But Rhodium included this particular scenario to illustrate the magnitude of possible outcomes. We really kind of want to see like what is the edge, what are the boundaries of potential outcomes we could see here, just to wrap our heads around that. So they found, and you can see on the right here, that as the details were proposed in the December 22nd notice of proposed rulemaking, the 45V rule will help drive a net emission reduction from electrolyzer deployment through 2035. And that's, if we just pick that middle growth scenario, assuming the announced pipeline actually gets built out, that could lead to about 14 to 45 million metric tons of reductions in aggregate greenhouse gas emissions. So you'll see on the left, it can be more or less pronounced if growth is fast and less if there's less electrolyzer deployment happening. As Alex alluded to earlier, there are several open questions still that Treasury and the administration are taking public comment on. And some of those elements, depending on the policy design choices made around them, could have some material impact on the emissions and the deployment rates that we're seeing here. So if we can move to the next slide, we'll take a look at 2 of the things just as a sample. And by the way, you guys should definitely follow up on the Rhodium website to look at this note in detail. I just kind of picked a few things, but it's a really interesting note. If we look at the potential option of grandfathering rule, which, as Alex mentioned, is currently not allowed for the hourly matching component, we can see trajectories of emissions increase depending, again, on how fast. If there's slow deployment, it's very marginal, small impact. If there's increased growth, that number can actually look very significant very quickly. And so these are the kinds of trade-offs that will sort of need to be balanced in the decision-making that's happening here. On the left side is another open question that the Treasury Department is taking comment on, which is, if we include a qualification pathways for electrolyzer projects that are being powered in some way by existing clean generation, how might we do that? They've outlined a couple of ideas. One is allowing nuclear generation that is being relicensed, and you could prove that basically, but for these projects, that clean energy might come offline, which would be an ideal. You see on that left chart the range of potential emissions impacts that could have. I'm short on time, so I won't go through all of these, but you'll see in this right graph basically what the flavor of different emissions outcomes could be, depending on how the open questions are treated in the final rulemaking. So the takeaway of this is, we use tools like these macro emissions analysis to try to understand what those trade-offs and emissions could be. And it's really a macro level view of the system. And there are really long views of that. So that was one element, one question we were interested in. The next question we were interested in is, okay, we kind of see what these edge cases could be. How will these specific elements of 45V now interact with other critical factors that play a role in shaping project finance and how the actual clean hydrogen industry evolves in the next few years? And so if we can move to the next slide, this is something I'll talk through. I will say, full disclosure, this is all really hard to model, really hard to make predictions around. So I'm just going to outline some of the ways these things impact project finance and the way that we might see this picture evolve. One thing is clean hydrogen technologies are still very much under innovation. The hydrogen rainbow, which some of you may have heard of, blue, green, pink, yellow, white, it continues to evolve. They're at different technology readiness levels. And so we'll see, right now we're talking a lot about electrolysis. There's also other production pathways like pyrolysis, something called natural hydrogen, also referred to as geologic hydrogen, which are basically natural hydrogen deposits found underneath the Earth's crust and certain rock formations. That's in very, very early stage of understanding how to extract that and what the implications of that are. These are all different ways of getting the same end product. And as Alex mentioned, the statute provided GREET as the life cycle analysis methodologies to run carbon intensity emissions calculations through. Some of these are actually not there because they're really new. And so Treasury provided guidance so that these new pathways have a way to request a provisional emissions route, while GREET provides a more comprehensive update. Ideally, that process is clear, it's accessible. The Department of Energy can work with taxpayers who want to petition for these provisional emission rates directly and make sure that there's no delay in that happening, and that there's a level playing field happening for all types of clean production pathways. So that's one element we're watching. We're interested in seeing how that develops, and we're optimistic about the way that the rules are written around that. Another thing I'll say is the clean hydrogen economy is still very much in its infancy. I know it doesn't feel like it because we talk about it quite at length, but the green premium of clean hydrogen production is still incredibly high. Demand for clean hydrogen is limited in certain end uses, especially ones we'd like to see for decarbonization. The long-term offtake contracts, which are really critical to actually get facilities built, are still very hard to come by, and all of these things increase project risk. So these are all elements that, now that we have rules, we're going to start trying to overlay those details on individual projects. Another thing is contract terms and structures are inherently very complex given the size of capital investments and the complexity of these technologies. And this is especially true for first movers, which is very much the case for electrolyzers generally. And then I also say building a hydrogen facility is one piece of a much bigger hydrogen puzzle. Our energy system is extremely interdependent, and things like grid congestion, long interconnection queues, lack of transmission lines to move increasing amounts of clean energy or clean electricity around the country will be a huge rate limiter for electrolyzer deployment and, frankly, for the energy transition writ large. So that's an element that is critical here that is both hard to quantify and estimate in models, but that will be really critical and will impact those deployment rates I mentioned. And then the other thing is, of course, as all things, the broader macroeconomic picture impacts things like cost of capital and interest rates, which further complicates the way that investors feel about making certain investments and how fast these projects take off and how much it costs to do that. So all of these factors interact along with 45V rules and will really determine how this pipeline of hydrogen projects will evolve in the coming years. What we're really interested in, now that the proposed rules are out, is to take those details and apply them to project permutations and say, okay, what actually is an impact, right? How does this rule function as a whole? What are the elements that make project finance challenging? Why is that? Is the timeline for phasing in certain elements of these rules too soon? Why is that? What is a more workable timeline? That's the kind of feedback that the Treasury Department is looking for in their comments. And, we've done a lot of emission modeling in the last year or so of all sorts. And I think what will be interesting now is to sort of do the bottom-up approach of applying rules to actual projects and say, what is going to move forward here? And the takeaway really is all of these details matter a whole lot. They have huge consequences. There are trade-offs to everything, and increasing or decreasing regulatory flexibility will come with trade-offs of some variety. The question is, how do you find that balance between rapidly deploying an emerging technology and also staying on track with our broader climate goals? That is a sweet spot that's really, really hard, and that I have a lot of respect for our friends in the different agencies trying to grapple with. So as you all wrestle with these details and these rules, and you start trying to collect your thoughts on input to Treasury on these elements, I invite you to sort of think about how to provide a perspective on what will and won't move forward and why, and how can we make sure that there's at least projects moving that are consistent with our broader climate agenda. Look forward to the conversation, but in the meantime, I will turn it over to Tessa.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maria. So the proposed guidance will create many opportunities to accelerate growth of the clean hydrogen market by clarifying compliant business models, as you alluded to, Maria, expanding the pool of eligible projects, as well as unlocking access to immediate and secure offtake markets found in Europe. So the strength of the hydrogen production tax credit was very successful in motivating large-scale interest in building out US hydrogen supply. However, all of that interest in developing projects has largely stalled due to that lack of regulatory clarity around what are suitable business models for a project that will be compliant with access to the tax credits. And each of the different proposals that have been under consideration regarding how we could go about regulating grid-connected electrolyzers have significant implications on a project level, on how projects and electrolyzers will operate, the set of investment technologies needed to give hydrogen to off-takers under the design specifications that they require, and ultimately the economics of different business models, of whether we're thinking about behind-the-meter production for our electricity supply, whether we're thinking about connecting to a grid. And so now that we have that regulatory clarity, or that we will have that regulatory clarity in time after the comment period, this will enable projects to move forward in their planning and move towards FID, which will be catalytic in getting the early market off of the ground. So the guidance also expands the market in that it provides this new pathway for clean electricity for hydrogen electrolysis, in enabling that access of electricity coming from the grid to qualify for the highest level of tax credits. And that was not necessarily a given. We know that our current grid is dominated by fossil generation. And so we needed to understand, how can we make the existing system of energy attribute certificates that can promote this decoupling and that tracking of clean generation with a purchase of clean molecules? How can we make that work for hydrogen? And how can we make that work under the pretense of really trying to motivate deep decarbonization of our grid and truly low emissions hydrogen production, given the sometimes decorrelation between what happens in this kind of virtual and more abstract buying and selling of energy attribute certificates, with what's actually happening on the ground and within the grids of how we're building out new electricity. And so the deliverability, the hourly matching, the incrementality guidance are really intending to ensure that some of those potential disconnects between what is happening in theory with what is happening on the ground will be moving forward in the direction that we would like to see for true decarbonization of our grid, right? And so ensuring that we are building out new clean electricity when we are buying new energy attribute certificates, ensuring that we are coupling where we're producing electricity and where we're consuming electricity, and ensuring that on a time basis that we are using clean electricity in times that we have it. And all of this is to essentially guardrail the expanse of electric loads onto the grid through the form of hydrogen, and inadvertently incentivize additional fossil generation to come on in the short term or in the long term to meet those new loads. To the next slide. So one way in which the guidance can help bolster early projects is through creating a pool of immediate credit qualifying electricity that can be used. So as Alex outlined, there's this 3-year window in which that new clean power must be built for it to be leveraged for hydrogen production. And so within these past 3 years, that electricity can start to be used for hydrogen production. And this may provide an opportunity for initial projects to avoid exposure to the long interconnection queues and costs associated with building out new and adding new clean electricity to our grid, and hopefully get projects off the ground faster and starting to promote that early rapid scale of electrolysis that will only lead to this positive feedback loop of reducing cost and promoting greater market growth. We have done some preliminary analysis to look at, given a perspective from NREL in their modeling of what energy attribute certificates are currently available and what under a kind of mid-case projection might be built out through to 2030. If those EECs were to be leveraged for hydrogen production, we're looking at roughly 8 million metric tons of hydrogen that could be produced. And this is by no means a upper bound of what we're expecting to see, but more of what might we be able to expect. And we need to actively support further development of clean electricity in order to enable the joint decarbonization of our power system, as well as our industrial system and heavy duty transportation system, and meet our proposed goals set forward by the US National Strategy of how much hydrogen we want to see. 10 million metric tons domestically by 2030. So we really do need to be thinking about this set of enabling framework on that clean electricity front in order to see hydrogen scale, right? So ensuring that we're prioritizing transmission planning, updating interconnection rules, streamlining permitting process, all to enable more clean electricity to get built, as that is really fundamental for clean hydrogen production. I also want to note that this analysis indicates that every hub will have enough qualifying attributes to meet their publicly stated goals and production volumes of hydrogen via electrolysis. So really, we're really expecting that this is only going to have an catalytic effect on the near-term market rather than a hindrance by any means. To the next slide. One other really substantial way in which this guidance is going to unlock the early market is through strengthening the demand for hydrogen. So one of the challenges that we've seen from the policy front is this mismatch of having far more supply side incentives than demand side incentives for hydrogen, and really having no pulls from that policy perspective of trying to mandate adoption of hydrogen. And so the desire to kind of start to purchase hydrogen from that offtake perspective has sometimes been slower than the interest we're seeing in building out supply, especially given that price premium, Maria, that you were discussing, right? About the market is nascent, clean hydrogen is still growing. Oftentimes it is more expensive than the fossil fuels that are currently used. And so what the proposed regulations do is they harmonize with Europe standards for renewable hydrogen imports. And what this does is it ensures that the US has access to the immediate and sizable European offtake markets, where they're targeting 10 million metric tons of imported production volume. To the next slide. So although there's ample opportunities to start to accelerate the market, this is also going to be dependent on our ability to design viable projects that'll meet these new implications associated with how we're going to need to procure clean electricity and the impacts that that will have on the operational profile and the set of investment technologies needed for hydrogen production. And so what the proposed regulations will do, largely due to the hourly matching and the deliverability constraints, is they will heighten a need for electrolyzer flexibility, intensify a need for storage, both of molecules and of electricity, as well as may elevate the need for hydrogen pipelines in both getting project by projects off the ground, as well as enabling the clean hydrogen market and electrolysis to scale in its entirety. So hourly matching, can we go back to that slide? Thank you. So hourly matching creates this inherent mismatch between how we may have to run the electrolyzer, given we'll have to run our electrolyzer when we have available clean power. And that might be running our electrolyzer to follow this profile of solar and wind, which can oftentimes be very peaky throughout the day. And that puts us in a mismatch to how we might need to deliver hydrogen to an off-taker, in that many of these industrial off-takers, such as steel manufacturing, chemicals production, ammonia production, they need to be running their industrial processes far more consistently and may require more of a steady stream of hydrogen to be supplied. So that dynamic of the flexibility in which we'll need to be producing hydrogen to be compliant with that hourly matching regulation, coupled with the consistency in which we may need to deliver hydrogen, elevates that role of storage. So the role of electricity storage needs to be clarified through the regulations to understand what will be compliant on that front. But regardless of that, there is going to be an intensified importance of low-cost hydrogen storage. So really thinking about geologic underground storage as a way to enable low-cost and at-scale hydrogen supply to feed into many of these industrial offtakes. We also find that that flexibility of running your electrolyzer is not just essential to enable compliance with this hourly matching, but least cost project operation is going to rely on flexibly produced hydrogen, in that you're going to want to be following kind of the low cost electricity, given that electricity is by and large the largest driver of hydrogen production costs, sometimes around 70% or more of the total cost of a produced kilogram of hydrogen. And so we're going to see that, both from a regulatory perspective and from a unregulated, if there were to be an unregulated markets perspective, those operational profiles starting to converge, and that we're going to need electrolyzers that can operate flexibly and ramp up and down very quickly, can start from no electricity input. And those types of technologies, we need to be scaling their supply chains and really investing in manufacturing pathways to promote project development. The constraints on deliverability may also promote at more of a macro level an increased role of interregional hydrogen pipeline transmission in unlocking access to least cost hydrogen supply. In that, as many of us are aware, there's this disconnect between where we have the cheapest and most abundant electricity within the United States with where we have our demand for electricity, as well as our demand for hydrogen. Projects may desire to, and it may be cheaper for developers to produce hydrogen in regions where there is lower cost electricity, given that, as we mentioned earlier, electricity is the largest factor driving the underlying cost of producing hydrogen, then transporting that hydrogen to the off-taker through hydrogen pipelines, rather than producing hydrogen near the demand using higher cost electricity, especially given now we are having these limitations on where we'll be able to build electricity to be compliant with these deliverability rules. And so that'll then, by contrast, motivate a need to move molecules if we want to unlock access to these lower cost energy resources to meet our demand. So these challenges are all very addressable. I think more of it just creates a difference in how we think about designing projects, and just that awareness of what we need to do to design least cost projects on an individual basis as well as a market basis is going to be essential when we think about planning for our growing clean hydrogen ecosystem. And with that, I will pass it on to Nathan for our Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tessa. think we're going to pull everyone onto the spotlight real quick. But we've gotten quite a few questions, and I will also include some questions that we've gotten from partners and conversations we've had over the past several weeks as the guidance has come out, and we've spoken to folks who are reacting to it. So to begin with, I've seen a lot of questions that are sort of about the remaining questions that Treasury has posed in the proposed guidance. I think we can think about this framework as sort of a partial or intermediate step, but there are a number of questions that Treasury itself asked to find additional edge cases and to better understand how to solve remaining issues. And so I've seen a number of questions about curtailment in particular. I've seen questions about interregional transmission and how to work across those borders that were set within the guidance. And then there's some other questions about time matching and the creation of these attributes. And what I will say is that within the guidance itself, there are a number of very specific questions that Treasury has asked for public comment on in order to pull together the final rules. And so if you are engaging with these questions for your specific project or your specific hub, I would highly recommend identifying those questions and pulling together a public comment so that Treasury can pull enough evidence to make a decision. But this guidance will continue to grow. This is kind of the first cut, but there are a lot of avenues where Treasury is going to add compliance pathways and add clarification over time. So really think of this, that February 26th date as a really important time to put your thoughts into the congressional record. I think we've heard about some other questions on edge cases for each major bucket, including incrementality, time matching, and deliverability that Treasury themselves has asked. And there's also a lot of questions specifically around renewable natural gas and some of these more complicated beyond electricity schemes that Treasury is trying to design out as well. So it's definitely worth engaging there. Maria, I've seen some also questions about the pathway for these additional pathways, maybe not electrolysis or natural gas pathways. Can you talk a little bit more about what you see as the process there?
Sure, happy to. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the statute requires that this credit, the tiering system and the carbon accounting is done through something called GREET, which is a life cycle analysis methodology that Argonne National Laboratory created years ago and is used in other policy contexts, like the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard uses their own adapted version of it. This particular tool has a number of pathways, and you basically, it's a calculator for those of you not familiar with it. You can input information on what your pathway is, and it helps you arrive at a carbon intensity model, or excuse me, figure. Not every single pathway of producing hydrogen is in there today. I mentioned as one example something called natural hydrogen, also known as geologic hydrogen. It's such a novel way of producing hydrogen, and so it's not in GREET. What we understand from the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking is that GREET will be updated this year. I'm not sure what the level of details there are. Hopefully it's a very robust update to include new pathways. For those that are still not included, because there's not enough technical analysis to do that yet, there is something called a provisional emissions rate that a taxpayer can petition Treasury for, and that's basically going to be done through the Department of Energy. They're going to administer that. They have not yet, but are soon. I think April, if I'm recalling correctly, is when they will provide guidance on what will be required of taxpayers in that application to help determine what that rate should be. And that, as the rules currently say, and I believe they are taking comment on this as well, is that provisional rate will sort of take precedence until a future GREET update includes your production pathway. So that's how that's being handled now, but comments are being taken on that as well. And it would be great to hear from those new entrants what of that is helpful or where more clarity would be valuable.
So thank you so much. I'm actually going to put you back on the hot seat because I'm seeing a lot of questions about how projects can sort of navigate these requirements. And there's this need to build out this data infrastructure in order for projects to get bankability and to kind of, build the plumbing to get this tax credit flowing. Can you talk about sort of what you see as sort of what's coming next in terms of getting the market ready for this credit and for the projects that are coming down the pipeline? I think you're on mute.
Classic. I was going to say that's a meaty one. I'm happy to provide some thoughts and welcome Tessa and Alex and Taylor to jump in as well. I think the interesting part about this tax credit is that it will be different for almost every single project because it depends on what region it's in, what combination of assets is underlying the renewable energy credits, if that's what they're using, or how to secure a PPA that satisfies the energy demands. And so I think there'll be a combination of having to do some overbuild, which will have cost implications for individual projects, and they'll have to look at that. There's also the question of, generally speaking, how long it will take to create the system. Some assumptions were made at the Treasury Department from a lot of input from folks. I think I've seen out there estimates from 1 year to multiple years. And so for now, Treasury said we're going to aim for 2028, and that should provide sufficient time for the availability of an hourly REC system. But if for some reason that's not going to be possible, this is the time to show some math on why, and sort of provide recommendations on what's a more reasonable approach. Is that helpful? And happy to have others add into that.
That's super helpful. Maybe we can combine this with another set of questions that we're seeing about how these rules sort of impact the economic of projects and the structure of projects. Tessa, are you seeing any regional differences among how this particular tax credit is changing different archetypes of projects with some of your analysis?
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. So what we see, right, and kind of comes down to the ability to use electricity is there are going to be regions that are going to be lower cost producers of hydrogen than others. And sometimes that is disconnected to where we have demand for hydrogen. And the entire system, right, of ensuring that we can supply hydrogen to off-takers, both on the kind of physical level of getting it to where they are, as well as on more of the kind of temporal level of getting it to them when they need to have the hydrogen, is where a lot of the additional cost to projects may come from through some of the regulations, right? So we talked through earlier the impact of needing to have storage in your system. That may have an impact on increasing costs in certain periods of time, but on the same front, you are now able to start to produce hydrogen and enable your project to have access to an immediate pool of demand in Europe. And so that could help get project off the ground and provide a pathway towards business model and project viability that wasn't otherwise found domestically. We also see that project costs may be heightened due to this overarching additional infrastructure need through, say, pipelines, if we're going to really be trying to access these low-cost electrons that might be far from demand. Ultimately, how this is all going to shape out is subject to a set of factors far beyond, I think, anything within the guidance itself, but more of factors that impact fundamentally our ability to build out clean electricity and build out clean hydrogen that come from permitting processes, that come from getting electricity added to the grid, that come from providing de-risking to investments to get projects off the ground. And the quicker that we can do that, the quicker we're going to see favorable economics for clean hydrogen and electrolysis projects at large. And I think that's something to really emphasize too, is that some of these early enablers that we'll see through these proposed regulations are going to be supportive in helping the market scale in the near term. And that is going to lead to a quicker reduction of costs for clean hydrogen at large against fossil fuels, as well as electrolysis in general. And that is going to be beneficial for overall decarbonization goals.
I can make one more point too, Nathan. I think that certainty and risk mitigation are what will drive bankability for these projects. And there are, as Nathan highlighted earlier, and we've mentioned throughout, there are some really big outstanding questions and areas that Treasury is seeking comment that will further certainty, that could enable further flexibility. And that includes that what is going to happen with existing clean power right now, that 5% proposal is included. That includes questions around how electricity storage will be treated when it comes to hourly matching, as well as, again, those missed hours is a single hour going to be counted amongst an entire year? Is there going to be sort of an averaging effect of the emissions across a year, or will single hours be pulled out and not impact a facility's ability to capture the credit? There are a lot of ways in which this rule and these rules get further clarified, and that certainty is increased, and flexibility or further rigidity sort of is established in the final rulemaking. And just want to really heighten that importance of everybody dialing in on those questions, because, you know, as much as we can predict and describe right now, there is so much more to sort of tease out. And really huge thank you and props to Treasury and everybody in the federal government doing that work. So please help them.
Excellent. We are going to follow up with answers to far more of these questions. There are a lot of excellent ones in the Q&A session, and we will respond to those in kind in the coming weeks. So thank you all for engaging with this Q&A session and putting all of those great insights in the comment section. We will make sure to get back to all of them. But just to kind of close out some of this discussion, with this hydrogen tax credit, we kind of are at the end of the first stage of this process. Congress has issued a staggering technical challenge, identifying ways to calculate and measure comprehensive from well all the way up to the gate life cycle emission pathways, covering everything from agriculture to methane to electricity to CO2 to co-products and beyond. And the guidance to date is a monumental technical achievement, hence the complexity. But it's only the first step to the ultimate goal, which is a physical, in the real world, economically competitive clean hydrogen industry. And over the coming months, there will be a comment period and a hearing on February 26th. The comment period closes in March 25th. The hearing happens. So I hope that all of you engage and provide, you know, real world analysis and perspective in order to improve this guidance as it evolves. And there are opportunities to identify new pathways for qualification, edge cases, sticking points in your financial models, and to answer the questions that Treasury has set in the guidance. And while it's easy to think of all of these issues as isolated or one-offs, it's important to note that they are all interconnected. They add up to a system. And the core insight from here on out is to pull those pieces together and think about this system as a whole and understand how adjustments impact the overall market. But starting now, there is a need for private industry and for organizations to start building. And first and foremost, the necessary next step is to build the data infrastructure, the plumbing through which all of the tax credits will flow. And this guidance provides a framework to start building off of. As RMI, we look forward to continuing that work of understanding what needs to be built and working on putting all of the pieces together to ensure that we can see industry lift off. So with that, I'll pass it back to Taylor.
Thanks, Nathan. I think Nathan closed this out pretty well thoughts-wise, but just a few logistical reminders. We'll immediately be sending out a recording to everyone who registered with this recording and also with their contacts to really continue the conversation. Our team is going to need, you know, a little bit of time to go through all of the great questions that we got. I'm seeing a little over 60 on my end right now. And maybe some other bonus content that we plan to publish. But we hope to get that turned around within the next week or so. So please be on the lookout for that. It'll all be living in the same resource center as the recording. So again, thank you so much. We'll give a couple minutes back and hope to talk soon. Thank you, everyone.